and welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. Today, we're going to talk about Madeleine of France.
One day we will be remembered.
It's one of those episodes, guys, with a name we don't often see. Joining the ranks of Jacquetta, Ermengarde, and Euphemia, we have Madeleine of France, sometimes called Madeleine of Valois. Madeleine of France was born in the year of our Lord 1520 at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye in France. She was the fifth child and third daughter to King Francois I of France and his wife, Queen Claude. Fun fact, we've mentioned her parents before. If you remember the Field of Cloth of Gold, where King Henry VIII met with King Francis is Madeleine's father, and Madeleine's mother, Queen Claude, was 7 months pregnant at the time with Madeleine. Madeleine attended the Field of Cloth of Gold 2 months before she was born. That's how cool she is. She was, however, born rather frail, and that is how they used to say weak immune system. If something was just going around, she was probably picking it up and not thriving through it. And this didn't seem to change as she grew up. She grew up in the warm and temperate Loire Valley instead of Paris because her father was worried that the cold climate of Paris would be detrimental to her already fragile health. Her mother, Queen Claude, died when Madeleine was just 4. This would have been sad, but Madeleine was only 4 and wasn't being raised by or living with her mother. She lived with her Aunt Marguerite of Navarre and her sisters Charlotte and Margaret. Just 2 months after the death of her mother, Madeleine's older sister Charlotte died at the age of just 7. She had also always been delicate and frail, and at 7 she contracted the measles, and this would have had a much larger impact on 4-year-old Madeleine. This was a sister who she lived with at the time of her death. The following year, Madeleine may or may not have known, as she lived away from most of her family, and she was still very young, but when she was about 5 years old, her father was captured by the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, that same guy who sacked Rome. He was busy. In order to gain his release, a deal had to be made, and he was exchanged for his 2 oldest sons, Madeleine's brothers, Francois and Henri, 7 and 6 years old respectively, and they were kept in Madrid for 4 years. When Madeleine was about 10 years old, her father remarried, and she moved in with her stepmother, Eleanor of Austria, and the following year, her brothers were returned to France. When Madeleine was about 13 years old, her brother, Henri, was getting married to Catherine de Medici. Catherine de Medici wasn't royal. She wasn't even noble. What she was an extremely rich orphan. She was the only child from a wealthy banking family, and her parents had both died within a month of her birth, and her uncle was the Pope. Unfortunately, Henri, her betrothed, was already in love at 14. He loved someone else. He had entered into a relationship with Diane de Poitiers. How long had he been in the relationship? We don't know, because it wasn't public, it was a secret. But 2 years before this, when Henri was in a tournament at the age of 12, he was already wearing Diane's colors. So it's almost cute, except that Henri, at some time between 12 and 14, started a relationship with Diane de Poitiers, who was at that time between 31 and 33, his late mother's friend. And he was like, "Hey, girl," and she was like, "Yeah, I'm into 13-year-olds. Yikes." And Henry was marrying Catherine. But Henry was in love with Diane. If you've seen the show Reign, okay, I'm just going to spoil it now. It's not real. It's super fake. It's bad. There's a lot of not true stuff in Reign. Sort of inspired by history, I would say, maybe. Like, inspired by, at most. But if you've watched that, King Henry II, he is with Diane de Poitiers. But they don't say that she is the age of his mother, that she is 20 years older than him. Diane de Poitiers was 20 years older than King Henry II. So by the time Madeleine was 16, she was still frail, and she had contracted consumption, or as it's sometimes called, tuberculosis. At its most basic, this is the way tuberculosis can affect someone. When you first contract it, you are contagious. You have a fever, you have tuberculosis, and other people can catch it. You then either get better or die. If you get better, you are better, but with weakened lungs and immune system. After this initial illness, it does come back. During the reemergence, it isn't contagious anymore. But you have a pretty nasty cough and a fever, and again, you either get better or you die. And this time, you are now better, with an even weaker immune system and with even more damaged lungs. Rinse and repeat. How well you do is mostly based on your immune system and how your body can take care of you. But because of your weakened state, it gets harder and harder to fight off every time. Eventually, you are bound to die instead of getting better, especially if you're someone who it keeps coming back for, because you aren't fighting it off well. Around this time, her oldest brother and heir to the French throne died at the age of 18. He may have died from a reemergence of tuberculosis, but word on the street was he was maybe poisoned. He played a game of tennis, asked for some water, drank some water, collapsed, and then died several days later. An investigation was done. Torture ensued and people confessed, but torture, so who knows? Catherine de' Medici, his sister-in-law, was reportedly well known for her fascination with poisons, and poison was kind of the way the French royal family liked to kill each other. It was their thing. But also, Catherine de' Medici was Italian, so there's a lot of clues, but we don't know what they add up to. 3 years before Madeleine's birth was the Battle of Flodden. That was the battle that we spoke about in Margaret Tudor's episode. The battle with Queen Catherine of Aragon. We spoke about it in her episode too. Queen Catherine was the Queen of England and defeated King James IV, her brother-in-law, killing him in the process. The Scots ran to France for an ally, and an agreement was made that King James' son, the new King James, would be married to a French princess that hadn't been born yet. Remember in Margaret Tudor's episode when the pro-French region of Scotland was like, no, girl, I'm good in France. You take care of it. I'm finding a wife for your baby. That's where we are. 3 years before Madeleine's birth. Madeleine was going to be that bride, but because of her lifelong poor health, another option was put forth of Mary of Bourbon. Mary of Bourbon was less royal, but more healthy and more likely to survive the Scottish climate. In 1536, that year sounds familiar, 1536 is the year Anne Boleyn was beheaded, if you listen to season 1. So in 1536, the 24-year-old King James V traveled to France to meet his new prospective bride, the 21-year-old Mary of Bourbon. Once in France, King James found himself smitten with the delicate 16-year-old Madeleine. She was young, charming, witty, and vivacious, but she was also sick. After having tuberculosis, she suffered from recurrent symptoms. Everyone just hoped that eventually she would get better and stay better. But she also really wanted to be a queen. King James asked Francois I if he could instead marry the king's daughter, Madeleine. King Francois said no, she won't survive the Scottish climate. But James didn't take no for an answer. He kept pressing the king to be allowed to marry Madeleine, and Madeleine made her own interest known as well. She wanted to be the Queen of Scots just as much as James wanted her to be the Queen of Scots. King Francois eventually capitulated. He agreed to allow his daughter to marry the King of Scots against his own judgment. In preparation for their wedding, James purchased many things for Madeleine. He bought her clothes and furnishings. She also received many gifts, jewels, gold chains, linen, cloth, clothes, veils, trimmings, and a new bed even. The royal wedding retinue entered Paris on the 31st of December, 1536, and the royal couple were married on the 1st of January, 1537. They then went to a banquet that night at the great hall of the Palais de la Cité. The wedding celebrations didn't end there. Over the next fortnight, there were further celebrations and tournaments. King Francois I provided Madeleine with a generous dowry of 100,000 gold crowns and a further 30,000 francs. Madeleine, in exchange, renounced her own and any of her descendants' claim to the French throne because no one wanted another 100 Years' War. It's like, you can have my daughter, but your kids better not come back claiming to be the King of France like England did over there. If James were to predecease Madeleine, she would retain her lifetime assets, including, but not limited to, the earldoms of Fife, Strathearn, Ross, and Orkney, along with Falkland Palace, Stirling Castle, Dingwall Castle, the Lordship of Galloway, and Thrieve Castle. After months of celebrating and going on their wedding tour in France, the royal couple was going to return to Scotland in May 1537. On the trip to Scotland, Madeleine's health deteriorated from its already fragile state. She was extremely ill when the couple landed in Scotland. Madeleine took up residence at Holyrood Palace, along with her household members who came with her from France, including her former governess, her nurse, and her secretary. Madeleine wrote to her father in June 1537 that she was feeling better. Her husband, King James, wrote to the king, asking him to send a doctor from France. Madeleine agreed the doctor could come, but just to perfect the cure she had already claimed to have found. Less than a month later, 1 month short of her 17th birthday, Madeleine died in her husband's arms. She was known as the Summer Queen of Scots. King James wrote to King Francis informing him of his daughter's death, and in that letter, King James called Madeleine my dear companion. Madeleine was interred at Holyrood Abbey, next to King James II. If you are getting lost in the sea of Jameses, that means she was interred next to her husband's great-grandfather. It's kind of poetic. He also died young, not too long after finding his true love. It works. One of her gentlewomen said that Madeleine had no good days after her arrival in Scotland, but always was sickly. There was an imbalance of the humors. She had too much mucus, and that is what they thought caused her death. In a way, it kind of did. The mucus probably didn't kill her. She had tuberculosis, combined with the Scottish climate. The four humors didn't have all of the information needed, but you can kind of follow the logic. According to the four humors, people could die from an imbalance of humors, including too much phlegm or not enough blood, another humor. Probably both things that seem to cause death in people, like not enough blood. That is a valid death reason. That's why bleeding people was so popular. They thought you could also die of too much blood. Gotta balance that out. But the science was settled for their time. They were working with things they could see with their eyes. And they just didn't have all the information yet. And that is where I'll leave it for now. What did you think of Madeleine of France? She had a short life. She only lived 17 years. And she was only queen for the summer. But being a queen did seem like her main goal. But in her 16-year-old mind, being a queen was all she wanted. And she did get that at the very end of her life. If you want to get in touch with me, you know how. I say it nearly every episode. Just listen to another one. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next week, bye.
Will be remembered.
Thanks for listening.